Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was a devil's advocate. Character study. An accidental meeting brings Zetsu into Naruto's life as his tutor. With Zetsu trying to sway Naruto to his own philosophy of the only one you can rely on is yourself, Naruto discovers that the world isn't as black and white as his tutor is, that there are at least two sides to every story, and that he has a lot to learn. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 4, Reliance and Autonomy. Are you comfortable being used by others, or would you rather forge your own path, heedless of the outcome? Naruto sat in a field comprised of short grass and leafy plants, examining the surrounding flora with careful hands. It was still rather early in the morning, and beads of dew allowed his fingers to glide smoothly over the greenery. 5 days had passed since Team 7 had arrived in the Land of Waves, during which time Kakashi had assigned him, Sasuke, and Sakura to learn how to climb trees using only chakra. Fortunately, his time spent in the company of Asuma and Team 10 had given him some insight into that exercise already, allowing him to complete it a little ahead of his dark-haired teammate, who would certainly get the hang of it within the next day. Now, with that under his belt, he had finally found the opportunity to sneak out of the house they were staying in to explore the surrounding area. He thought that Zetsu might be pleased with his initiative to learn about the different vegetation of the various countries, an effort to expand his education on his own merit. It was, perhaps, the one positive aspect of the mission thus far. Despite his own irritation at performing D-rank missions, which were essentially equivalent to chores, a fact that Zetsu found highly amusing, for some reason, it was Sasuke who had politely insisted upon being assigned a mission of a higher caliber. After some thought, the Hokage had given in and assigned them a C-rank mission to escort Tazuna the bridge builder back to his home country of the Land of Waves. Things had gone south pretty quickly after leaving the Hidden Leaf, a pair of missing nin known as the Demon Brothers attacking them along the trail. Though he and Sasuke had held them off with only mild effort, it was Kakashi who had eventually captured and interrogated them. The silver-haired man had then allowed his team to continue the mission by way of majority vote, despite any potential danger ahead. For his own part, Naruto hadn't particularly cared one way or the other about the changed mission classification. While his teammates had been irked at their client's deception, Naruto had, silently, appreciated Tazuna's misdirection. The man had done everything in his power to ensure that his request would be taken, to make sure that his livelihood, and the livelihood of his fellows would improve. It felt kind of like a corollary to Zetsu's philosophy of relying only on oneself. In order to accomplish what you wanted, you did whatever it took to get results. Granted, Tazuna was working for the benefit of his entire village instead of for himself, but that was a minor quibble. The theory was still applicable. Still, the blonde had gone along with his teammates' decision simply to explore other lands. There were sure to be different species of flora in the Land of Waves than in the Land of Fire, and searching for them would pose an interesting experience. Unfortunately, more trouble had arrived in the form of a man known as the Demon of the Hidden Mist, Momochi Zabuza. Kakashi had fought the former member of the Mist's 7 shinobi swordsmen to what had basically amounted to a standstill, as Zabuza had been incapacitated, apparently not killed, as Kakashi had originally assumed, by an accomplice, while the silver-haired man had passed out from chakra exhaustion. Hence Kakashi's focus on preparing his team for the eventual rematch with Zabuza and his associate. None of that really mattered at the current time though. While Kakashi predicted that Zabuza would attack Tazuna within the next couple of days, Naruto knew that his sensei would be the one fighting the A-rank Nukenin while he and his teammates protected their client. So, in the meantime, the blonde would enjoy the brief break granted to him by his completion of the tree-climbing exercise to indulge in botany. The difference in climate between the Land of Waves and the Land of Fire made a nice contrast to what plants grew in each country. While the forests and fields which surrounded and comprised Konoha were filled with brightly colored flowers and deep green canopies, the vegetation in the Land of Waves, at least where he was short and dull. There were tall trees interspersed in clumps throughout the nation, but they didn't seem to have any of the liveliness that permeated the greenery of the Land of Fire. Most interesting were the groves of mangrove trees that decorated the shores of the island nation. Such foliage was unusual in the land of fire, where salt water sources capable of growing them were rare. He didn't think they had much in the way of medicinal or poisonous properties, but simply observing the different environments of other countries was rather cool. Naruto's perusal of the plants in the field was interrupted by the soft padding of approaching footsteps stepping on dew-coated grass. Playing it safe, he scooted backwards until he could feel bark against his back before allowing his head to flop to the side, appearing to the world that he had merely fallen asleep against a tree. The footsteps came close enough that Naruto could feel a presence standing beside him. There was a rustle of cloth as the person knelt down, and Naruto fought every instinct that shouted for him to stab a kunai into the gentle hand that was placed on his arm. "You probably shouldn't sleep out here," said a soft voice. Naruto opened his blue eyes with deliberate lethargy, trying to maintain the appearance of having just been sleeping. "NNN-HM?" He blinked slowly to add to the effect. "Oh, I must have fallen asleep while training. Thanks for waking me up." The girl kneeling before him offered up a soft smile. "It was no problem. I wouldn't want you to catch a cold." Naruto crossed his legs and adjusted his position, so he was leaning more comfortably against the tree, blue eyes taking in the features of his new companion. Black hair fell down to the middle of her back, framing her large brown eyes. She wore a sleeveless, pink kimono with purple swirls that was held together by a white obi, and the light colors made her pale skin look even more so. A dark choker around her neck was the only contrast to the alabaster color. "How come you're out here so early?" "I was looking for some plants." She blinked doe-like brown eyes at him. "Judging by your headband, you must be a ninja. Would you be willing to help me?" Zetsu's voice echoed in his head, reminding him that people could only rely on themselves, should be able to take care of themselves, and accomplish tasks by themselves. Naruto chose to ignore it in favor of potentially learning about some of the plants native to the land of waves that he couldn't identify. "Sure," he answered. "What are you looking for?" His companion held out a basket containing several different types of flora. Blue eyes gazed over the collection, widening slightly at some of them. "Is something the matter?" the girl asked. Naruto shook his head in response. "I've just never paid much attention to the different kinds of plants before." "Do you know what all these do?" he asked, making his eyes bigger to further express his awe. "Of course," replied the girl, hands searching the surrounding grasses. When she didn't elaborate, Naruto also got on his hands and knees and began looking for the desired vegetation, though he kept his companion in his periphery, wary of her motives. Although he couldn't say for sure what all the herbs in the girl's basket did, Zetsu's lessons had taught him the properties of some of them. He recognized yarrow and what Zetsu liked to refer to as chase devil, though Naruto knew it better as goat weed, both of which were known for their medicinal properties in healing wounds, relieving pain, and clotting blood, all symptoms which Zabuza would be experiencing. And the former mist shinobi did have an assistant. Naruto mentally tried to rid himself of that thought. Just because he and his teammates were preparing for the demon of the hidden mist to return didn't mean that every random person collecting herbs was suspicious. Sakura had told them the state of Wave's citizens the other day, and it didn't seem like looking for cheap herbal remedies would be uncharacteristic for any one of the natives. Then again, that would provide the perfect cover for any assassin hiding in their midst. He sighed quietly. Zetsu's lessons had nurtured a healthy sense of paranoia that was unbelievably frustrating to deal with. Still, it would do to be cautious around this stranger, just in case. After all, he didn't even know her name. Just as he opened his mouth to ask his companion that exact question, she asked him, "Do you have someone who is important to you?" "Ha! Someone important to you," repeated the girl, "a precious person who you would do anything for." Naruto didn't respond right away, instead keeping his attention focused on the greenery he was picking. The question was familiar, if worded differently, to one he had been forced to answer almost a month before, and he wondered if anything had changed in that time. Kakashi had proven to be as distant with his students as he had the first day they'd met, when his answers to his own getting-to-know-you questions had been vague and uninformative. The silver-haired man kept himself removed from the interactions of his 3 genin on missions, interjecting at intervals only when he felt a fight might break out or his students were losing sight of the mission parameters. His protection of the 3 of them plus Tazuna during Zabuza's initial attack had affirmed his dedication to his own protect-your-comrade speech, which Naruto found himself appreciative of, because holy crap was Zabuza out of their league strength-wise, but otherwise the Jonin had shown himself to be reserved and withdrawn. Unfortunately, that personality quirk had carried over to his training methodology, a trait that Naruto found rather irritating. It was, he felt, a Jonin sensei's duty to teach his students useful skills which would help them in the field, and Kakashi's lessons had so far been quite lacking in substance. The silver-haired man seemed to believe that simply allowing his subordinates to perform D-rank missions would build their teamwork, a quality he continued to place emphasis on, despite all evidence to the contrary of his team embracing it with open arms, to levels sufficient enough to survive in the field. Zetsu had been correct when he had told Naruto not to put his faith in others to assist him, as Kakashi had yet to do so. Not only had his teamwork plan proved to be flawed, but Kakashi had a habit of showing up long past the time he had assigned his team to meet up, resulting in hours wasted doing nothing. After 3 days of confirming this pattern, Naruto had decided that his time would be better spent doing anything else, sleeping, for instance, and hadn't shown up until several hours after Kakashi's designated meeting time. Surprisingly, the Jonin had already been there when he had arrived, and he had reprimanded the blonde for his tardiness, emphasizing that punctuality was an important trait for shinobi. Naruto had quickly pointed out his teacher's hypocrisy, stating that if Kakashi couldn't be bothered to show up on time, then why should he? When Kakashi had shown up late the next day, though not by his usual amount, Naruto had returned the favor by showing up late the day after that. From there, the competition had spiraled into a routine of either Kakashi or Naruto being late, with only a few occasions where they both showed up on time. If the Jonin had reported him to the Hokage, as he'd threatened to do, Naruto had yet to hear anything. But Kakashi and his philosophy promoting teamwork and his lack of training exercises were only one part of the problem, Naruto's teammates were the other part. Sasuke had shown himself to be as antisocial as Naruto had originally predicted and remembered from his academy days. There were moments during certain missions where the dark-haired boy had proven himself capable of working with others, but after a while, Naruto had started to realize that the boy was only doing it either because Kakashi was forcing him to or because he didn't trust his teammates to complete the job successfully. That analysis had been confirmed when Sasuke had gone along with Naruto's convoluted plan to free Kakashi from Zabuza's water prison technique during their first battle only after determining that he couldn't beat Zabuza's water clone on his own. Even then, the Uchiha had been rather skeptical that his teammates' plan would work, probably because it was Naruto's plan, and heaven forbid if he could do anything right. The dark-haired boy's arrogance was perhaps his most vexing personality quirk. Naruto had known of the Uchiha clan years ago. They were honestly hard to miss, patrolling the streets with a red and white fan sewn into the collars of their clothes, and their power had been rumored to be the strongest within Konoha. Their downfall was a travesty, and the blonde felt bad for Sasuke, knowing what it was like to have no family around, but the last Uchiha seemed to be riding the coattails of his clan's reputation. Sure, Sasuke was strong, probably the strongest genin of their graduating year, if not at least the most well-rounded ability-wise, but his inability to grant those he saw beneath him the time of day was grating. Every invitation to hang out together that Naruto had offered the Uchiha in an attempt to befriend him, per Ino's suggestion, had been rejected with some statement about how the blonde was inferior to him. Worse than Sasuke though, and Naruto was amazed at how that could even be possible, was Sakura. The pink-haired girl had a single-minded determination that centered around only one thought: Sasuke. Her infatuation, crush, love, whatever it was, Naruto honestly wasn't sure how to define it, made her difficult to get along with, especially considering Naruto's prior attitude with respect to both her and Sasuke. No matter how many times he insisted he wasn't asking the kunoichi out on a date, Sakura refused to go anywhere with him alone. Naruto wondered if Sakura's answer would change if he ever tried asking her to do something with him while not in front of Sasuke, but as the pink-haired girl never wanted to be caught alone with him, that theory continued to remain untested. In an effort to get her to change the opinion she had of him from the academy, the blonde had even dropped the Chan honorific from her name, so it seemed like he was less interested, and his enthusiasm when confronting her, which used to be unnaturally high thanks to his crush on her, had decreased to a point that interacting with her was no different than interacting with anyone else. It hadn't worked, but Naruto felt better about himself for having gotten over whatever infatuation he had held for his female teammate, regardless. Perhaps the most exhausting characteristic about Sakura was the fact that she had potential as a kunoichi, but lacked the correct mindset to apply it. She had an amazing brain that was capable of storing unbelievable amounts of knowledge, but her keen intellect was wasted pining after the last Uchiha. If the first day of tree climbing was any indication, her chakra control was also phenomenal, a trait rare in ninja, let alone ninja her age. The matter of actually utilizing that potential was the real problem. But the attitudes of all his teammates, Kakashi included, meant that Naruto's attempted foray into befriending the people he was stuck working with had ultimately been unsuccessful. Looking back, the conclusion had been foregone weeks prior, but in fairness to trying new things, the blonde had given his teammates a plethora of chances to change their minds, and subsequently, his opinions of them. Unfortunately, it seemed as if they were unwilling to do so, leaving Naruto to label them as lost causes in his quest for camaraderie. On the other hand, his relationship with Ino had slowly but surely improved over time. While the platinum blonde shared several personality traits with Sakura, a short temper, and a strange obsession with Sasuke, Ino's lack of association with the Uchiha on a daily basis meant that she was willing to engage in conversation with Naruto without fear of looking bad in front of her crush. It was a quirk that Naruto had no compunctions taking advantage of, as his association with Ino had so far proven to be the closest thing to a real friendship he had. Ino was interesting. Her tendency to say the first thing that came to mind, heedless of whether it could be construed as an insult, was an idiosyncrasy that Naruto appreciated. In a weird way, it reminded him of his relationship with Zetsu, who stated his opinion blatantly, and without a care for the other person's feelings. Honesty, he had discovered, was a valuable trait in the ninja world, if only because of its rarity. Her hesitance in accepting him as a friend, dwindling as it was also an alluring quality. Naruto had always enjoyed a challenge, getting what he couldn't have, or testing the limits of how far he could push social norms, and swaying Ino's low opinion of him, from the days of the academy to one where she didn't mind being seen with him in public, had proven to be just that. She had recently decided that it didn't matter if it was known that they hung out on a semi-regular basis, and although she hadn't said so yet, Naruto felt that his fellow blonde was one step away from willingly calling him her friend. That was a milestone that the Jinchuriki wanted to achieve. His association with Ino had actually had other positive results. For one thing, he had learned a lot more about how Shikamaru, and Choji interacted, which was rather hit and miss, given Ino's bossiness and the two boys' apathy and nonchalance, and his relationship with the two boys had also grown as his visits to Team 10's training grounds had become more frequent. While Asuma wouldn't teach him anything, stating that it wasn't his place to interfere with his colleague's regimen, no matter how much Naruto insisted there was no regimen, the bearded Jonin also never sent Naruto away. Such treatment gave the blonde the opportunity to study things like the tree climbing exercise, though without anyone's guiding hand, learning said tricks was slow. Still, he was gradually teaching himself how to reproduce techniques and skills by observation alone, so it was better than nothing. It had even allowed him to finish Kakashi's training ahead of Sasuke, even if not by much. Actually, it was because he spent much of his free time with Team 10 that he had yet to start focusing on crafting poisons. Well, that and the fact that D-rank missions were hardly of the caliber that required the need for poisons had allowed him to justify to himself, anyway, putting off creating them. Honestly, the C-rank mission had come as a surprise. He had expected Kakashi to give Team 7 some warning before accepting one. He supposed it was a good lesson about always being prepared for the unexpected. Zetsu probably wouldn't approve of the fact that he was spending more time trying to connect with his peers instead of improving his abilities, but then again, the plant man was so stuck in his ways that anything that opposed them was likely to be looked at as pointless. Fortunately, his status as a genin offered a valid excuse as to why he had less free time than when he and Zetsu had initially met, and so his sessions with the plant man had been sparse enough recently that Zetsu's commentary on his actions was kept to a minimum. Regardless, even with the revelation that he could be friends with Ino, Shikamaru, and Choji, Naruto wasn't sure he could ever do as Kakashi preached, as the will of fire demanded. The members of Team 10 were his comrades, yes, but would he sacrifice his life to save one, or all of them? He'd certainly protect them if the option was viable, but to lose his own life in the process? That was inane. His worldview was now molded into a strange dichotomy. When it came to Team 7, Naruto knew he could only rely on his own abilities. With Kakashi's indifference, Sasuke's arrogance, and Sakura's incompetence, he had no chance of gaining anything valuable from his association with his teammates. It supported the idea he had picked up from Zetsu, that individualism was the only thing he could believe in. But on the other side was Team 10, a group of peers he had grown to enjoy being around and was even friendly with. He could trust them to some extent, though without working with them, the level he could actually rely on them was questionable. The answer to the girl's question was no, but Naruto wanted to hear what she would say. "Yeah, I do," he finally responded. His companion nodded. "That's good. When a person has something important to protect, that's when they can truly become strong." Naruto resisted the urge to snort. He was only becoming stronger because, well, if he was honest with himself, it was because Zetsu had decided to take an interest in him and point out his flawed way of thinking. Zetsu, his tutor, was the only other person of significance within his life, and their relationship was simultaneously simple and complicated. The plant man saw him as a project, or an experiment, a person he took a chance on to pass down his ideals. If Naruto managed to survive the challenges life threw at him on his own merit, he would essentially prove Zetsu's philosophy correct. He wasn't sure he wanted to fully analyze the complexities of his and Zetsu's relationship, so he let any remaining thoughts float away, instead choosing to focus on his companion's words. They sounded suspiciously similar to Kakashi's idealism in their support of camaraderie, though with their own twist of supporting strength over friendship. Given that Naruto's experience with protecting something important was non-existent, and in direct contrast to the things Zetsu had taught, his companion's statement was nothing but empty words. He lifted his head at the sound of rustling clothes. His female companion was rising to her feet. "I think I've gathered enough herbs," she informed him. "Thank you for your assistance. It was a pleasure meeting you. Perhaps we will meet again somewhere." Naruto nodded once, his blue eyes following her movements as she made her way out of the clearing. "Yeah, you too." This isn't gonna end well, Naruto thought. Team 7 had gone to the bridge to offer their full protection to Tazuna after Kakashi had announced himself fully recovered. In a twist of coincidence that was surely a curse, Zabuza and his assistant had arrived to complete their task of assassinating the bridge builder. While the demon of the hidden mist had immediately occupied Kakashi's attention, his assistant Haku had been ordered to take care of the genin. Of course, Sasuke had decided to take the lead and attack Haku on his own, once more displaying his arrogance in his abilities. To his credit, the Uchiha had actually managed to hold off Zabuza's assistant for a short while, proving himself marginally faster than the fake Hunter Nin and capable of avoiding his attacks. Up until the point where Haku had created a dome of ice mirrors to trap both the dark-haired boy and the nearby blonde. Then he had melded into the mirrors and started peppering them with Senbon. Naruto made a mental note to get a lot better at throwing Senbon. If he could eventually achieve Haku's levels of speed and accuracy, he would become a force to be reckoned with, especially if his weapons were poisoned. But that would require surviving Haku's attacks. He and Sasuke now stood back to back, watching and waiting for their opponent to make his next move. "Any ideas?" he asked his teammate. "Try to avoid getting a serious injury," Sasuke said. "His chakra must have a limit, meaning that he can't keep this up forever. He's already starting to slow down, and I can't counterattack and watch over you at the same time." Naruto grunted in both acknowledgement and annoyance. Sasuke was clearly still underestimating the blonde's skills if he thought that Naruto wasn't aware of that factoid already. Kunai were clenched tightly in both of his hands to better block any needles Haku sent their way. There was a clang of metal on metal as he deflected several senbon aimed at his vitals, wincing as he felt others pierce his legs and shoulders. Soon enough, it wouldn't matter that he had avoided being hit in vital spots, because he'd be rendered immobile enough to not be able to dodge anything. The next several moments were devoted to the two genin deflecting and attempting to dodge Haku's senbon, gathering enough metal needles in their bodies to resemble human pincushions. "You've done well to avoid dying thus far," resounded Haku's voice from everywhere, "but I can no longer afford to waste time." Every image of the ice user manipulated a single hand through seals at a blazing speed. Hijitsu, Sensatsu Susho. Naruto felt an impact on his back, and went sailing forward as 1,000 needles created from moisture in the air cascaded down on his previous position. Rolling clumsily into a crouch, he watched as Sasuke finished leaping away from the impact spot, the Uchiha's eyes a blood red. The blonde wasn't sure if he was more impressed at having survived the attack, or at Sasuke saving his life by kicking him out of harm's way. Then Sasuke let out a strangled gurgle and fell forward, two senbon protruding through his neck. As his teammate's body collapsed, Naruto could see that Haku was in the mirror behind the Uchiha, his arm extended from having thrown the projectiles. "Your friend managed to save you from a death blow. It is unfortunate that he was left vulnerable. And now his sacrifice will have been in vain." Haku sped out of the mirror with senbon clenched between his fingers, and Naruto, in a maneuver that would likely prove ineffective, prepared to throw a punch to forestall his imminent death. Haku stumbled suddenly, and Naruto's fist impacted the boy's porcelain mask with a force born more from Haku's momentum than his own body. The blonde blinked as the ice mirrors surrounding him melted into water and splashed to the ground, then quickly went to the downed Haku and held a kunai to his throat. "Well, not sure what happened, but at least I'm alive." Naruto walked into the area he now considered to be Zetsu's forest, grateful to be back in his usual environment alive and whole after the fiasco in the Land of Waves. Though the entire situation had been resolved, the progression of events had been nothing if not hectic. His suspicions about the woman in the forest had been proven correct when, upon the removal of Haku's mask, the two had proven to be one and the same. While killing his enemy had been the most prudent idea, Haku had taken the situation out of his hands by utilizing the body flicker technique to place himself in the path of Kakashi's lightning cutter, saving Zabuza's life. The boy's death had been immediate, and after an exchange of words between Zabuza and Kakashi, the former's employer had shown up and broken their contract. Such treachery had prompted the demon of the hidden mist to charge into the group of mercenaries his employer had brought along, killing several before taking out the head honcho himself. Naruto's shadow clones had dissuaded the rest of the mercenaries from trying anything else, and Team 7 had remained in the Land of Waves to watch over the completion of the bridge that was supposed to save the country's economy, and to let Sasuke, who hadn't actually died, recuperate before returning to Konoha. After the incident in the Dome of Mirrors, Naruto hadn't been sure what to think about his male teammate. Sasuke had performed a selfless act to save him, which, considering the boy's personality, was rather uncharacteristic. Naruto had thought that something might change between them, and thus prove his previous analysis wrong, but once the Uchiha had recovered, their status quo had returned to normal, and the blonde had written off the act as a spur-of-the-moment decision that was unlikely to ever be repeated. In fact, if at all possible, Sasuke's attitude towards him had gotten even worse after it had been revealed that Naruto had been the one to incapacitate Haku. It was almost as if the Uchiha resented him for taking out the enemy when he had been unable to. "Oh, Naruto-kun. You're back. Was your mission successful?" The blonde looked up to find his tutor gazing at him from the trunk of an oak tree. Yeah, I guess." He paused before continuing, "Hey Zetsu, can I ask you something? Would it stop you if I denied your request?" Naruto plowed forward, ignoring the plant man's snarky attitude. "When I was in the Land of Waves, we ran into a nuke-nin by the name of Momochi Zabuza. He said that in the world of shinobi, There are only those who use, and those who are used, Black Zetsu recited. White Zetsu picked up where his counterpart left off, stating, he also said that shinobi are simply tools. Quite a model shinobi. How did you know that? Naruto stammered, shocked. We were there, White Zetsu offered simply. Did you think that we would allow you to voyage outside of the village with only your team for backup? What would happen if you were attacked by someone beyond your capabilities and killed? Our investment would be for naught. You followed me to the land of waves? Naruto had thought that his tutor was relatively indifferent to what happened to him, but with this development, it was entirely possible that he was mistaken. Perhaps Zetsu, in his own detached, independent way, actually cared about his well-being. That was unexpected. Everything Zetsu had said pointed to him being completely apathetic to what happened to Naruto. By the plant man's own logic, it was the blonde's duty to fight his own battles and be dependent on his own abilities, and if he couldn't, he would suffer the consequences. But this new revelation pointed to Zetsu actually displaying some modicum of concern, maybe, for his pupil. If Naruto had misjudged Zetsu, someone whom he thought he had figured out, was it possible he had prematurely judged his teammates as well? Maybe, but then again, did it really matter all that much? He had already made peace with the fact that he and his teammates didn't get along. What did it matter if his opinions were wrong or biased? With the amount of opportunities he'd extended to them to be, at the very least, civil, experience had taught him that he didn't even want to associate with them beyond what he already had to. He would keep his opinion open to any changes he observed on the off chance his preliminary analysis was incorrect, but otherwise there was no reason to fret over whether he was right or wrong about his teammates' personalities. Zetsu continued talking. We wanted to take a vacation, and where better to go than to assure you weren't misled while away? The two mercenaries that tried attacking the house you were staying in weren't very tasty, though. Maybe next time we should go to the land of Earth, White Zetsu suggested to his counterpart. Their people taste much better, more meat. Naruto shuddered a little at that. Zetsu's need to eat people was something that he still had yet to get used to, despite having almost been the plant man's meal himself. He shook his head to rid himself of the mental image. So, you were there, the blonde verified. Yes. How else do you think you survived the boy with the Hayaton Kekei Genkai? That was you? Naruto-kun, you need to learn to increase your observational skills. The Jinchuriki opened his mouth to protest, but Black Zetsu cut across him. Without any explanation, your opponent tripped before being able to deliver the finishing blow. Didn't you find that suspicious? Well, yeah, Naruto admitted, but... He trailed off as the sight of a vine slithering along the forest floor caught his attention. Nature is unforgiving. We were watching from the tree line, and when you appeared to be in danger, we interfered. You need to grow strong enough to defend yourself. We won't always be around. Nor do we want to be. That's, well... Naruto wanted to say thank you, but he felt that Zetsu wouldn't care. The plant man probably already knew he appreciated the help. He shook his head vigorously. That's all beside the point. I wanted to ask you about what Zabuza said. There is nothing to say. We agree with Zabuza. You do? Of course. We would not be as we are now if his statement was untrue. Naruto fell silent at that. Zetsu had never told him outright about what had happened in his past, and although the blonde had been curious, the urge to pry had been tempered by both Black Zetsu's irritability and respect for his tutor's privacy. From hints Naruto had picked up in conversation, he could determine that whatever had happened to Zetsu and Kusagakure was not something the plant man had willingly partaken in. His musing was interrupted by the dual-toned man. You claim that your goal is to become Hokage, right? Well. As Hokage, the lives of every shinobi and civilian within the village are yours to command. They are your tools, the implements by which your will is carried out. A chain of command is established by assigning those of lower rank to serve under those above them, from Genin to Chunin to Jonin. The ANBU work directly for the Hokage, carrying out his will no matter what it might be. In other words, they are also his tools. White Zetsu's yellow eye blinked at him. Don't you remember what we told you about your YT Naruto-kun? Yeah, but I guess I never really thought of what that meant for me. He frowned at the ground, lost in thought. I don't want to be someone's tool, so that would mean I'd have to become Hokage, right? Why did you want to become Hokage originally? Oh, I wanted people to respect and acknowledge me. Black Zetsu laughed cruelly. What a worthless dream. To become the leader of a village, whether recognized as a Kage or not, you must already possess respect. Either that or power, and often the two go hand in hand. With neither in your grasp, your capacity to become Hokage is a fool's errand. Beyond that, the plant man's lighter side continued, the Hokage is not an all-powerful position. Naruto cocked his head to the side. What do you mean? Although he reigns over the citizens of the village, the Hokage must still answer to other powers. The council, the clan heads, his advisors, the daimyo, the Hokage must please many other parties to remain at the top. It is a delicate balance that is more trouble than it is worth, and your desire to reach that position is nonsensical. Why would you want to be in charge of the village and its people? Do you care about their lives? That argument sounded familiar, and Naruto realized with a start that it was practically the same thing Zetsu had told him when describing Konoha's belief in the will of fire. Remembering the conversation, Naruto arrived at the conclusion that the Hokage had to be the firmest believer of the will of fire within the entire village, and he understood with startling clarity that he would never possess the correct state of mind to actually take up the mantle. For one thing, if what Zetsu said was correct, he had no sway within the village, which not only meant that his reason for wanting the position was backwards, but it was also impossible to achieve. To erase the years of prejudice and animosity the villagers held for him, whether due to the Kyuubi or his prankster reputation, would take more than a few years, he supposed, if he was being optimistic. Konoha was a huge village, and getting everyone to change their opinion of him was an unlikely occurrence. It was likely only working with Ino, Choji, and Shikamaru because of coincidence, he and Ino sharing an interest in flowers, followed by her long-standing relationship with her teammates and his prior affiliation with them in the academy, that he would be unable to repeat for the general populace. Beyond that, experimenting with trying to form bonds with his teammates had taught him that he really didn't believe in the will of fire. Naruto didn't have anyone precious enough to want to throw his life away for, nor a reason to, given everyone's treatment of him, and that seemed to be a requirement to become Hokage. He could appreciate the sacrifices the previous Hokages had made so far. The Yondaime, after all, was still a heroic, amazing man, but the blonde wanted to live past the age of 30. Not that that was a likely scenario with a career as a shinobi, but the likelihood probably increased when you weren't expected to lay down your life for the sake of the village. His revelation posed a problem though. If not Hokage, what did he want to become? Strength was certainly a prerequisite of whatever he wanted to do, as survive was a good priority, but to achieve a sufficient level would require years of work. In the meantime, he would be forced to work as a tool of his village, but remaining in that position was not something he wanted. He wanted to become self-sufficient, self-reliant, kind of like Zetsu, just less creepy. However, if even the Hokage was a tool, what career path would lead him towards his desired lifestyle? He looked up at his tutor. Hey Zetsu, you're a shinobi but not a tool, right? How'd you do that? The plant man's mouth stretched into a slightly maniacal grin. You leave. Only by abandoning all which you are familiar with can you achieve such a status. When you're on your own, the only person you answer to is yourself. That makes sense. In order to not be treated as a tool, he had to make it so that there was no one else in his life that he had to listen to. But to abandon the hidden leaf? That was a little hard to imagine. The mission to the Land of Waves had taught him a lot about what being a missing nin would consist of. Kirigakure apparently had an entire branch of ANBU devoted to hunting down their renegade shinobi. Who was to say that Konoha didn't have a similar system? As a genin, it would be near impossible to escape the hidden leaf and hope to avoid any shinobi that were sent to track him down. But beyond the impracticality of doing that, Naruto wasn't sure he really wanted to leave the hidden leaf. Despite the lack of any real comrades, barring Team 10, Konoha was still his home, and he had nowhere else to go if he did abandon it. Then again, he considered, glancing at Zetsu, his tutor had left his home, though probably under extenuating circumstances. The plant man instead roamed the world without any real aim, simply enjoying the splendor of his surroundings. Naruto frowned. That lifestyle was contingent upon Zetsu being able to fend for himself, which came back around to being strong enough to do whatever he wanted. The whole ideology was rather cyclic. Trying to escape the confining role of being a tool was proving to be rather difficult. Well, it wasn't like he had to make a decision right now. He was sure to be stuck within Konoha for the foreseeable future, so he would focus instead on increasing his abilities and discovering his own niche within the Hidden Leaf's hierarchy, regardless of having to obey orders. That would require intense focus on his shuriken jutsu and physical conditioning to become at least as good as Haku had been. That was a good first plateau to aim for, considering the skills he was hoping to specialize in. If nothing else, the mission to the Land of Waves had taught him that he needed to buckle down and start taking his training seriously. And he would actually have to start utilizing all the knowledge Zetsu had imparted upon him. Zetsu, he began, features settled in a determined expression, I need a way to carry around different plants and poisons. Any ideas? The former Kusanine grinned. We have just the thing for you, Naruto-kun. Chapter 5, Promotion and Stagnation. When testing the limits of your strength, does it matter what your rank is, or is the designation arbitrary? Naruto sat at his dining table, blue eyes fixed on the saucepan he had placed on the stove. The stovetop was a bit faulty, with the feed flue coming in bursts and intervals. Whether because his apartment building was old or because his landlord was biased against him, the blonde didn't know, so boiling water took a little more time than it should have. He was getting used to the wait time, having performed many similar experiments over the past several weeks, not to mention years of making instant ramen, but even so, his patience was not limitless, and so he had intentionally used less water to try to decrease the time it would take to boil. That, plus less water meant the poison he was brewing would be more concentrated than his previous doses, or so Zetsu said, anyway. Naruto would freely admit that chemical jargon made little sense to him, but he trusted what his tutor told him with regards to this subject. Particularly because Zetsu knew that he wasn't academically gifted. The blonde's dining table and surrounding floor was laden with scrolls, bowls, towels, weaponry, and plants, among other paraphernalia. Latex gloves littered the wooden surface, and small ceramic orbs with flat bottoms and short necks, capable of sitting in the palm of his hand, were set to one side, most of them with cork stoppers and labels written in an elegant kanji. Unlike his table, the Jinchuriki's apartment was relatively clean, if a bit ramshackle. The walls were in dire need of a paint job, and several jagged cracks announced the need for spackle in some places. Naruto's furniture, limited to a simple futon, a dresser for clothes, and a two-door storage cabinet, was placed in the corners, allowing him to maximize the middle space of his home. There was a potted plant beside his bed, and another one next to the dining table, which stood by the dresser. His kitchen area, consisting of a refrigerator, stove, and several cabinets for cookware and non-perishables, took up the corner area on the opposite side of the table. All of the appliances were old but functional, and Naruto knew that once he could safely afford it, replacing them, or finding a new place to live, would be his top priority. Aside from that, his home was bare. Most of the old pictures, posters, and odd notes that had been stuck to the walls during his academy days, proclaiming hatred for Sasuke, love for Sakura, the latest idea for a prank, etc., had been torn down and trashed almost immediately after returning from the Land of Waves. Naruto considered it a rebirth of himself, marking the time when he had finally accepted the lesson that Zetsu kept hammering into his head: his life was his own, and other people didn't matter. That wasn't entirely fair to Team 10, whose members he was on good terms with, but Naruto also didn't feel the need to broadcast his feelings by keeping mementos reminding him of those whose company he enjoyed. Besides, it wasn't like he had visitors to point out how empty and impersonal his apartment was. His chair scraped against the wooden floor as he pushed away from the table and stood, walking over to the now boiling pot of water. He turned off the heat and reached into the saucepan with a nearby pair of chopsticks. When he withdrew his hand, a small branch with lip-shaped green leaves and small but thin candle-like white flowers was held in the chopstick's grasp. The plant was thrown away and the chopsticks set back down on the kitchen counter before Naruto grabbed the handle of the saucepan and set it on one of the towels covering the dining table. Grabbing one of the empty ceramic orbs, he placed it on the table before him before once more gripping the handle of the pot with both hands. Carefully, he tilted the contents of the saucepan into the jar, making sure not to spill a drop. When he was done, he placed the pot in the sink and then returned to the table. Picking up a dozen of the senbon Zetsu had given him, he placed them in the ceramic and then sat back down in his seat. The brew the blonde had just made was something Zetsu called curare. Apparently, it was one of the deadliest poisons that could be created from the flora native to the Land of Fire, killing a person from anywhere between 1 and 25 minutes, depending on the dosage and where it was injected into the body. At this point in his training, Naruto doubted he had the skills to accurately hit someone's veins from afar, as the sooner it entered the bloodstream, the sooner it acted, but with any luck, the onset time would increase with increased injections, meaning he could theoretically overload an opponent with curare-tipped senbon to kill him. Curare was just one of the many new poisons Naruto had started creating. He had begun utilizing different plants to formulate concoctions for a variety of scenarios. His collection of senbon and kunai was now coated in a small but growing mixture of paralytics, poisons, sleeping agents, and hallucinogens. Of course, part of the problem in dealing with poisonous weapons was that said weapons had to actually strike the enemy to be effective. Naruto knew that it would still take some time before his capabilities were good enough to consider himself a specialist, but at least he had a start. It had taken a bit of experimentation and a lot of double-checking information with Zetsu to figure out how to do everything, but the blonde felt that he now had some confidence in his poison crafting skills. Actually, he owed the plant man a lot. By some method, and Naruto was honestly unsure if he wanted to know how it had been done, Zetsu had acquired the sealing scrolls, ceramic orbs, gloves, and syringes for him to use in the poison-making process. He assumed his tutor had ransacked the hospital for at least the gloves and syringes, which he was grateful for, as he didn't particularly like to go there, but the procurement of the scrolls and orbs were a mystery. He would have to remember to ask the plant man where he had gotten them, as both tools were proving immensely useful. The scrolls contained some sort of seal that labeled whatever contents were inside of them, so that the wielder could summon whatever he wanted with ease simply by applying chakra. Currently, they were mostly empty, but Naruto planned on filling them with the plants he had gathered, extra senbon and kunai he couldn't carry on his person, his poison-making tools, and the ceramic jars. The scrolls would enable him to become a sort of walking apothecary, a profession Zetsu had told him about when discussing the usefulness of medicinal plants. The jars, a simple mahogany color, were an addition to his future skill set that he hadn't anticipated. They were sturdy enough to prevent leakages of any poisons he decided to store in them, but easily breakable when thrown or dropped. That meant that, in addition to liquid poisons placed on weapons, he could toss out the equivalent of poison bombs that could be inhaled by or splashed on the enemy. Naruto grabbed a small book placed next to the sealed ceramic jars and set it down before him, opening it up and skimming its contents. As he had started taking Zetsu's lessons seriously, he had come to realize that there was far too much information about the plants he wanted to use, location, description, what parts were useful, among other interesting tidbits, for him to simply remember. So, he had decided to invest in a cheap notebook, that he could scribble down whatever notes he felt important when Zetsu was lecturing him. It was also a good way to keep track of what concoctions he had created, how he had done so, and the results of their use. Picking up a pencil, he jotted down a quick note describing the brewing process on the page dedicated to curare, making sure to leave a spot to note its effectiveness at a later date, when he somehow found a way to test his creations. Flipping through several pages, the blonde stopped at one and then put on a glove to pick up a piece of bark from a small pile laid out before him. The manchineel tree, he read from his notes, inspecting the bark, one of the deadliest trees in the world. Its sap irritates the skin and can cause blistering if you simply stand under the tree while it's raining. He put down the bark and grabbed a slim branch with small, green, apple-looking fruit on it, referencing his notes once more. The fruit is dangerous if eaten, not that that's likely to happen. Seriously, what was he going to do? Walk up to his enemies, hold out his hand, and ask them to please eat this? No, he thought, returning the twig to the table, removing his glove, and eyeing the bark. What I need to figure out is how to use the bark. According to what Zetsu had told him, the smoke put off by the tree when burned blinded anyone whose eyes it got into. It was even better than a smoke bomb in the sense that the blindness was permanent and debilitating enough to take advantage of it in the midst of battle. As potent a weapon as the manchineel tree could be, Naruto couldn't think of a method to burn the bark without blinding himself in the process. Goggles might work. His old pair was still sitting in one of his drawers somewhere, though he had meant to get rid of them, but his skin would also be unprotected. Completely covering himself could stop that, but the blonde still didn't know of a way to capture the gas in one of the ceramic jars after burning the bark. It was a dilemma that had him stumped and irritated, if only because utilizing the manchineel gas would be an excellent way to stall his opponent, allowing him to hit with his poison Senbon. Zetsu might know of a solution, but after everything the plant man had done for him already, Naruto didn't know if he wanted to ask for more favors. The former Kusanin's charity wasn't bound to last long, and while the blonde felt that taking advantage of the small window of opportunity might be a good idea, he also felt that it was a bad one to push his luck. Besides, there probably wasn't anything productive he could accomplish immediately to finalize his preparations for the Chunin exams, anyway, which were starting in about an hour. Naruto wasn't entirely sure how to feel about the Chunin exams. On the one hand, it was a new experience that opened up an opportunity to advance his career, but the Jinchuriki knew that he was sorely underprepared for whatever awaited him. Kakashi's training hadn't done anything to improve his skills, and Naruto was sure that, if asked, Zetsu would only give him minimal useful advice in training simply because the plant man would want him to learn things on his own. Sighing, he placed a hand upon the scroll the manchineel tree bark was on and applied chakra. In a burst of smoke, it all disappeared, and all that remained was black kanji identifying those plants were sealed within. The rest of the greenery on the table was sealed within the same scroll before it was rolled up and set aside. Naruto did the same with his equipment: pot, gloves, syringes, towels, etc., senbon and kunai, and ceramics, storing the latter scroll in his kunai pouch with numerous pre-poisoned weapons. The other scrolls were hidden within his topmost dresser drawer, leaving his dining table clean. He double-checked his supplies and headed towards the door. Opening it, he stepped outside and glanced back at the interior of his home. It was clean and organized despite its slightly battered appearance, a stark contrast to how the blonde had kept it before meeting Zetsu. In a way, it was rather symbolic of how far he'd come in his progression towards being more self-reliant, how far he'd deviated from his old self. Naruto shut the door behind him and headed towards the academy. Well, here goes nothing. I hate the Chunin exams, Naruto thought, scowling down at the paper in front of him. The first test was taking place in one of the largest rooms at the academy, and was essentially the blonde's worst nightmare, a written exam. Contrary to popular belief, Naruto wasn't stupid. He was impulsive and not gifted with academic know-how, but when he applied himself, to his pranks, to Zetsu's teachings, he could accomplish great things. His lack of knowledge in subjects such as mathematics and history weren't a reflection of his intelligence, but a mark of his shaky attention span and disinterest. That said, the difficulty of the questions on the paper in front of him was sure to cause him to fail the test. They looked to be impossible to answer, even if he had paid attention during his days in the academy. But worse than that was how the Chunin exams had started. Sasuke, for some reason Naruto couldn't fathom, had credited Sakura with discovering the genjutsu warping the second floor of the academy building to look like the third one. The dark-haired boy's uncharacteristic generosity had quickly dissipated back into its usual arrogance when a boy clad in green spandex, sporting an awful-looking bowl cut of shiny black hair, had challenged him to a fight. It had been rather amusing to watch Sasuke get his ass handed to him by Rock Lee, who was, apparently, a taijutsu specialist, and thus a perfect matchup to negate any advantage Sasuke's Sharingan gave him. Despite Lee's teacher interrupting the fight before it could get out of hand, Naruto had held out hope that his teammate's attitude would be easier to deal with after the proof that he wasn't the most powerful genin in the Hidden Leaf. Instead, his loss had seemed to galvanize the Uchiha into challenging those peers he considered to be equal or above him in strength as a way to prove his superiority, notably Rock Lee and Hyuga Neji. Sasuke's usual attitude was only one cause of his irritation, though. His mere presence was the other, as simply seeing the Uchiha had acted as some sort of trigger on Ino when Teams 7 and 10 had come together in the testing room. Team 7 walked into room 301 and looked around, taking note of all the faces that glared in their direction as they entered. Almost immediately, Ino appeared from seemingly nowhere and jumped on Sasuke's back, squealing excitedly in his ear. This action prompted the beginnings of an argument between Ino and Sakura, while Naruto stood to the side, eyes fixed on his fellow blonde, waiting for her to greet him. "Not gonna happen," grunted a voice behind him. Naruto turned to the left to find Shikamaru and Choji approaching him, the former with his hands in his pockets, the latter munching from a bag of chips. The blonde's confusion must have shown on his face, for Shikamaru sighed and stated, "Ino's not gonna pay you any attention with the Uchiha around." Naruto blinked. "But we're friends." Shikamaru shrugged. "It's nothing personal, it's just how she is. All we've heard for the past week is how she can't wait to see him. It's annoying that all of our teachers nominated us for the exams," he grumbled. The blonde tossed a glance over his shoulder to spy Ino and Sakura engaged in a furious exchange of words, Sasuke doing his best to avoid his two fangirls. "I'm a little surprised you showed up," he said, returning his attention to the two boys, trying to disregard the betrayal he felt at being ignored. It would have been too troublesome to argue with Ino. At that point, Team 8 had shown up, and Inuzuka Kiba had greeted the assembled genin with his usual boisterousness. He had been followed by a silver-haired Konohanin who had introduced himself as Kabuto. After a brief look at several of Kabuto's ninja info cards, a trio from the Hidden Sound had attacked, only to be interrupted by the arrival of the first exam's proctor, which had prompted the beginning of the written exam. Naruto tapped his pencil against the wooden desk in frustration. All of his hard work befriending Ino, only for her to turn a blind eye to him in the face of her crush. Was that what it would always be like to have Sasuke on a team? That no matter how much he changed, all the strides he had made and would continue to make towards maturity, he would always be ignored in favor of his dark-haired teammate? That was galling. And moderately depressing. All the effort he had put into getting along with Ino now seemed to be a waste of time, and he wondered if it was worth pursuing their friendship in lieu of this development. Because, in the end, did it really matter? He had already given up on making friends with his teammates. Even though he considered the members of Team 10 his friends, the bonds he had formed with them were tentative. His determination to become more self-reliant supported a lifestyle that meant he could, probably, live without friends, as he had done for his entire life. They weren't a necessity, they were a perk, and one that he could do without if they were going to ignore his existence simply because someone more interesting showed up. Honestly, he had thought Ino was above the level that Sakura was, but apparently he had been mistaken. If she wanted to play the pretend you're not their game, he could too. It was petty, but his growth and maturity had its limits. Revenge, either in the form of pranks or giving someone a taste of their own medicine, was not above him. "Naruto-kun," whispered the voice of the person next to him, drawing him from his thoughts. He tilted his head slightly to see the speaker, finding it to be teammates Hyuga Hinata. For a moment, the blonde couldn't believe that he hadn't even seen who he'd been seated beside, but then he realized that the combination of his anger at Ino's treatment of him and the testing environment had caused him to lose track of his surroundings. The fact that such a lack of awareness was the equivalent of a death sentence in the field was not lost on him, and his blue eyes acquired focus on what was happening around him. There was a light flush of color in Hinata's cheeks, and she was pressing the tips of her pointer fingers together nervously. "If you'd like." She continued in the same, soft voice, "You can look at my answers, Naruto-kun." She positioned her paper so that most of her body was hiding it from the rest of the room, and only he could clearly see the answers peeking out from underneath the shadow of her arm. He stopped tapping his pencil against the desk and considered the proposition. The rules of the exam stated that participants started with 10 points, which were gradually lost depending on different factors. Each incorrect answer was a negative point against his score, and every cheating infraction was worth double that. If an individual's score hit 0, the entire team failed. Not answering any questions also caused the team to fail, which was problematic, as Naruto had no way of actually answering any of the questions. The cheating rule was a bit suspicious. Naruto had never heard of an exam that started with the maximum amount of points and then only penalized someone for cheating. After a period of thought, he realized the implications of the rule. They were supposed to cheat. Every incidence of doing so and getting caught was a penalty for not being sneaky enough, not for the cheating infraction itself. That still posed a problem, however, as Naruto had no method to cheat with. Not only that, but he had no target to cheat off of. Sasuke was resourceful enough to figure out a way to cheat, if he hadn't already, and Sakura was probably smart enough to answer at least a couple of the questions, meaning that he was the only one who couldn't contribute to the team. Unless he took Hinata up on her offer. The Jinchuriki's paranoia immediately surfaced. Why was Hinata offering him the answers anyway? Did she benefit in some way from doing so? Back in the academy, the Hyuga had been a reserved, shy individual, but she had also been one of the few people who hadn't, outwardly, considered him a nuisance. Her motive was unknown, but given what little he knew of her, it was probably harmless. His eyebrows furrowed together. Assuming Hinata's intention was good, and assuming he copied down the answers from her paper, how many answers should he copy? The proctor hadn't told them how many teams would pass. He seemed to be specifically keeping that number in the dark, so it was hard to say what the cutoff for points was to make it to the next round. There were essentially two options he could choose. The first was to copy down all the answers to retain the most amount of points possible, but that option opened him up more opportunities to get caught and penalized for cheating. The second was to take down only one answer to minimize the cheating penalty, hope that it was right so that he didn't fail the test on the no correct answers premise, and then trust that Sasuke and Sakura could amass enough points between them to make up his difference. Relying on Sakura and Sasuke to pull through with all the answers seemed foolish and counterintuitive to everything he'd observed and been taught. He could already hear Zetsu's voice in the back of his head telling him that putting his faith in his teammates would end poorly. Prior experience had taught him that. Self-interest was a strong motivator, but even if their tests were completely correct, his one answer, assuming it was right, and that could be a dangerous gamble, would leave them with 21 points, and that was assuming that none of them had been caught cheating. Hinata was still looking at him with a tinge of color in her cheeks, awaiting his answer as he waffled back and forth on what to do when a new thought struck. Does the test even matter? He had already decided that his previous goal of being Hokage was no longer a worthy one to strive for, and that his real agenda should focus on finding some way to not be used by people. That, as Zetsu had pointed out, was a near impossibility, while within a ninja village, although it seemed to lessen as a shinobi rose through the ranks and had less people to report to. Still, regardless of whatever title he held, he would still be used by someone, so advancing to Chunin didn't really progress him towards his ultimate endgame, becoming strong enough to rely on only himself. Rank was merely a global recognition of how strong a person was, but that wasn't necessarily an accurate gauge of power levels. A Chunin could beat a Jonin under the right circumstances, despite the latter being theoretically stronger. After all, hadn't he, a Genin, beaten Haku, who could be considered at least a Chunin, albeit with Zetsu's assistance? Being promoted simply symbolized that a shinobi's strength was finally being given credit, not that said shinobi hadn't already reached or surpassed the required level. In that sense, partaking in the Chunin exams made no difference to him, as he didn't really care what others thought of him. The premise of the exams was weird too. With several different villages sending participants to Konoha, whether allied together or not, the potential for the hidden leaf to influence who got promoted from other villages was rather high. It seemed strange that the villages hidden in sand, grass, waterfall, rain, and sound would allow another village, or all the other villages, to assist in choosing who advanced to the next rank. That decision should be left to each village individually, not to a group of them. But, it might still be useful to gain his village's recognition of his strength. Even if he did become a genin with chunin-level skills, having the Hokage officially promote him would be an indicator that he could actually stand up against other chunin in the village. That would be a good measuring stick of how far he'd come since meeting Zetsu. Besides that, chunin were apparently held to higher standards than genin, as they could be assigned to become captains of their own squads, that made them responsible for the lives of their teammates and the failure or success of a mission. While he didn't particularly care about the majority of the people within Konoha, being assigned to a position where he would essentially have to balance all the issues he'd spoken with Zetsu about would be an interesting test of his resolve, not to mention his ability to hide his true thoughts from the higher-ups of the Hidden Leaf. Naruto rested his head in his hands and massaged his forehead with the heels of his palms. The entire thought process was rather cyclic and contradictory, and, as he had discovered with Zetsu's tutored way of thinking of things from different angles, migraine-inducing. There was never a right answer, just a solution that best fit the problem given a person's outlook on life. The blonde reviewed everything he had just considered to try and reach a conclusion. Rank wasn't the greatest indicator of strength, it only signified how strong others considered you. It was a measure of where you stood in the world, how you stacked up against others, when you were considered strong enough to fend for yourself in the eyes of those above you. Oh! That was it, the solution to his problem of how, and better yet, when, to become fully self-reliant. He ran through the epiphany in his head, double-checking it for loopholes or errors, solidifying his new goal in his mind. To achieve it, however, he would need to pass the Chunin exams, but he wasn't so arrogant as to believe himself strong enough to get by on the first try. He had no skills in genjutsu and ninjutsu, barring the shadow clone technique. His taijutsu wasn't anything to brag about, and he was still a novice in creating poisons and using them effectively, which he figured would become his bread-and-butter specialty. It would take time before he could achieve a level of proficiency equivalent to that of a Chunin, so it didn't really matter if he passed now or not. It doesn't matter if I pass or not, he realized. If he did, well, then the potential for promotion was that much closer. If not, then he could shrug it off, train, and take the next exam that rolled around. Well, he thought, stealing a glance at Hinata's sheet of paper, if the end result doesn't matter, then I might as well go all the way, no reason not to. Besides, tickled a voice in the back of his mind, tinted with petty vindication, if I fail, then so do Sasuke and Sakura. It would serve them right for how they've treated me. Naruto started scribbling down the answers from Hinata's sheet of paper, trying to keep his head movement to a minimum. If nothing else, the exercise was a good test of how sneaky he could be while a group of superiors were keeping an eye on him. He was just looking over to copy down the 8th question when a voice called out, "Numbers 53 and 54, you both fail. Take your teammates and leave." Apparently, I need to be sneakier, he thought, pushing back his chair and standing up. Hinata, her limbs shaking slightly, did the same, and around the room, their teammates followed their lead, all with varying expressions. Sorry, Naruto-kun," she murmured as they walked towards the door. "I didn't think." "Nah, it's okay," he assured her. "Probably my fault anyway, not being sneaky enough. Besides, there's always next time." "Alright," she stammered, cheeks still flushed. The blonde wondered if she was just warm underneath her coat. The tinge of pink hadn't left her face since she'd first spoken to him. Her lavender eyes focused on something behind him, and Naruto turned around to find her two teammates exiting room 301 and coming into the hallway. "Kiba-kun, Shino-kun, I'm sorry." Kiba shot an irritated look at Naruto and shouldered past him. Naruto's blue eyes tracked him as he stalked away. It was probably this loser's fault, he grunted. "Come on, we'll just have to train twice as hard now, right, Akamaru?" The small white dog atop Kiba's head yipped in response. Hinata waved a hesitant goodbye to Naruto before following her teammate. Aburame Shino was only a step behind, ignoring the blonde as he moved along the corridor. Naruto thought he might be annoyed, but it was hard to tell with the sunglasses and concealing jacket he wore. Well, that probably could have gone worse. He turned back around to find the two other members of Team 7 standing before him. Sakura wore a look somewhere between disappointed and scared, and Sasuke was seething. It was strange to see so much emotion on the normally unflappable boy's face. The Uchiha stepped forward and grabbed Naruto's collar. "Naruto," he growled, "do you know what you just did? You cost me the opportunity to become a Chunin, to test my strength against some of the strongest genin around." Naruto blinked. So. This was my chance to close the gap between me and him, and you just ruined it, Sasuke hissed. "All we needed was for you to get one question right by cheating, but you couldn't even do that." "What do you want from me, Sasuke?" he asked, more curious than apologetic. "I want you to be useful, so that I don't get dragged down by your mistakes. Once a dobe, always a dobe. I don't even know how you managed to defeat Haku when I couldn't do it." "What's so funny?" he demanded as Naruto started laughing. "You don't get it," the blonde said. "Then explain it to me, dobe," Sasuke hissed. "Sasuke-kun, Naruto." Sakura interposed, "Maybe we shouldn't." "Quiet, Sakura," the Uchiha snapped. "Start talking, Naruto." The blonde sobered instantly. "Fine. You had all these opportunities to meet all these strong people within the village, but you're so damn antisocial and arrogant that you think everyone is either unworthy of your attention or beneath you. You thought that you could take on Lee when he challenged you, that your special eyes gave you some sort of advantage, but even when you're proven wrong, you still think you can take on all these people that are clearly stronger than you. But you can't, because you haven't done anything but rely on the abilities you already have, and where has that gotten you?" "Naruto, that's not fair," Sakura stated, her temper rising. "Sasuke-kun is." "You shut up," barked the blonde, and the pink-haired girl's mouth snapped close in shock. Naruto's blue eyes were steely. "You're next." "You know, Sasuke," he continued, returning his attention to the dark-haired boy, "for weeks I've tried to be nice to you, asking if you wanted to train after our missions, but all you've done is tell me how inferior I am to you. But what the hell do you know? Kakashi hasn't taught us anything, and while you've been busy being by yourself, I've been training. You don't know how strong I've gotten since we became Team 7. Maybe I'm strong enough to beat you now." Sasuke scoffed. "Unlikely." "You don't know that," retorted the blonde. "Then, just to rub it in," he added, "I beat Haku, didn't I?" "Fine," Sasuke stated, releasing his teammate. "Then fight me, right here, right now." Naruto resisted the urge to dig into his kunai pouch, pull out a poison senbon, and jam it into Sasuke's neck. "No. I'm done with you. You rejected all my offers, so now I'm returning the favor. And you," he continued, focusing on his female teammate, "where do I even start? You're so blinded by your so-called love for Sasuke that you don't see how useless you are. Have you even trained at all? Do you know how rare your chakra control is, or how good a kunoichi you could be if you actually focused on your strengths? And instead, you waste your life following this guy around, when he won't even give you the time of day." "You were the same way," Sakura said, finding her voice again, though it sounded rather feeble. "I changed, something which you would have noticed if you could focus on anyone or anything besides Sasuke." The blonde shook his head sadly. "You know what? I thought that I could turn you guys into my comrades, because Kakashi said that that was important, but after weeks of being treated like crap by you guys, I wouldn't want to be your friends even if you asked. Actually, I'm kinda glad that we failed the Chunin exams. You guys haven't shown that you care about me, so why should I care that you're mad at me for ruining your opportunity to become Chunin? Maybe if you were willing to work with me as a team, we wouldn't have failed the test. Blame me for this if you want, but the way we are, we only would have passed the exams out of sheer luck." There was silence in the hallway as Naruto and Sasuke stared at each other, Sakura eyeing them both frantically. Finally, the Uchiha grunted and turned away, walking towards the exit. Sakura's gaze swiveled between her two teammates several times before she followed Sasuke out. Naruto snorted. Some things never change. He looked down at his outfit, rubbing the white collar that Sasuke had gathered in his fist. His entire ensemble was loud and obvious, a cry for attention from a boy who desperately wanted it, needed it from others. He wasn't that boy anymore. I think it's time for a change. It seems your students weren't as well prepared for the Chunin exams as you thought, Sarutobi Hiruzen, Sandaime Hokage of Konohagakure, observed, puffing on his pipe. Hatake Kakashi inclined his head in slight shame. I didn't foresee them failing the first exam, Hokage-sama. I had hoped their showing would have been more impressive in the later stages. Yes, well, it seems like that opportunity won't come to pass. It appears as if Team 7 could use some more training, to better prepare for the next set of Chunin exams in 6 months. He looked up at his subordinate, and even through the mask, it was apparent that the Jonin was frowning. You disagree? Not at all. In fact, Sasuke has already demanded that I begin to train him even harder. I'm simply concerned about how their failure here will affect their teamwork, especially if Naruto and Sakura view this focus as perceived favoritism. Despite my attempts, their teamwork has always been a rather tentative thing, and with this development, well. Ah, yes, I see. The Hokage hummed thoughtfully before picking up a blank piece of paper and beginning to write on it. Kakashi peered at the message, though it was written in a code he was unfamiliar with. If I may ask, Hokage-sama, what are you writing? A summons for my student, Sarutobi answered. I have tried to contact him several times already, but he has been unresponsive thus far. Given this new development, I think it prudent to express an urgency that he returns sooner rather than later. As you are the only shinobi in Konoha with a Sharingan, you are the only one capable of teaching young Sasuke about his Kekkei Genkai properly. In order to allow you to focus on him, I will have Jiraiya oversee Naruto and Sakura's training. The silver-haired man bowed. As you wish, Hokage-sama. Naruto walked into the forest where Zetsu lived, a determined expression on his face. He was changing things, his relationships with his peers, his goals, his clothes, and there was only one more extension of his life that needed altering. Zetsu melded out of a nearby tree, his normal eye blinking in mixed curiosity and confusion. Naruto-kun, what a surprise! We had expected you to be taking the Chunin X. Train me, Naruto demanded. I want to know everything you can teach me. Chapter 6, Demands and Grants. When someone asks something of you, do you acquiesce willingly, or do you request something in return? Naruto stared into Zetsu's normal eye, retaining his determined expression to the best of his ability. His desire for actual training from his strange tutor was both honest and dire, but expressing it in words wasn't always the best form of communication. Action, showing Zetsu his resolve in addition to telling him, would better sell his case. Foolish child, do you not remember what we told you when we agreed to teach you? Yeah, I do, but I think you lied. White Zetsu's yellow eye widened in such a way that Naruto wondered if the plant man was offended. Why would we do that, Naruto-kun? The blonde shrugged. Dunno. Maybe to teach me a lesson, maybe because you wanted to. I figured you could tell me after I got you to agree to train me. You still think that we are going to agree to train you? He doesn't listen very well, White Zetsu informed his counterpart. You were much the same way. Yes, but I was enjoying my freedom. He is still enslaved by Konoha. Zetsu, Naruto interjected loudly. There was no telling how long his tutor's argument could or would go on for if uninterrupted. The plant man returned his attention to his pupil. If you had no intention of training me, why did you save my life back in the land of waves? There was silence for several seconds before the dark, throaty chuckling of Black Zetsu bubbled out of the former Kusanin's throat. Clever child, you've changed. Naruto allowed the barest of grins to grace his lips at that. He certainly hoped he had changed. His new mindset and outfit surely reinforced that idea. Gone was the eye-catching, garish orange jumpsuit with the white collar and blue shoulder panels. Now the blonde wore black pants that ended just above his black shinobi sandals, the little of his shins that was uncovered being wrapped in bandages. On top, he was clothed in a long-sleeved, olive-colored shirt that was loose on his frame, falling just past his waist and both wrists, enough to conceal any hand signs he wove from the enemy's sight. It also provided the added benefit of allowing him to stow extra senbon in the cuff's fabric, so that he could easily reach in with the opposite hand and grab a needle if the situation called for it. Hidden underneath was a short-sleeved, ash-gray shirt with fishnet for sleeves, several pouches hanging from the hem and connected to the waistband of his pants by clasps to prevent unnecessary movement, hidden from view by the outer shirt. The pouches held several of the ceramic jars Zetsu had gotten for him, as well as the summoning scrolls containing his extra weaponry, poisons, and plants. Everything was meant to be easily accessible to promote surprise attacks. Eventually, Naruto wanted to sew pockets into the interior of his long-sleeved shirt to provide more room for his poison weaponry, in addition to the senbon stuck in his cuffs. While it might take time to build the ability of plucking needles from his clothing at a speed fast enough to actually matter, the Jinchuriki thought it would be a good skill to learn. To defend himself from his own poison-coated weapons, fingerless, black gloves adorned his hands. The biggest change of all was the fact that his Hite-8, the Hite-8 that he had gotten from Irika on the night he had learned a valuable lesson, was no longer wrapped around his forehead. Instead, it hung loosely around his neck, a knot tied at the base of his neck keeping it in place. It was, he thought, rather symbolic of his new attitude to not become a tool. He would support Konoha when it benefited him, but his primary allegiance would be to himself. He wouldn't sacrifice himself for the sake of others, as the will of fire seemed to demand. Yeah, he responded, I have. Now, are you gonna train me? Instead of replying, Zetsu turned his head so he was facing the largest open space in the immediate vicinity. Naruto caught a luminescent glow come from, of all things, Black Zetsu's abnormal yellow eye right before an image appeared in the open space. Startled, the blonde jumped backwards, nearly tripping over a large root in the process. Tell us what is wrong with this picture. What's? He cut himself off and focused intently on the image before him. It appeared to be some sort of projection depicting a dome of icy mirrors, but the vantage point was from far away. Through the gap between individual mirrors, Naruto caught glimpses of a fast-moving person, Haku, zipping amongst the icy constructs, peppering his orange-clad self and Sasuke with senbon. This is my mission in the land of waves, he realized. From Zetsu's perspective? How did you get this? He stepped forward and waved his hand through the projection. Is this some sort of genjutsu? That is insignificant. We recorded the battle for future reference. Now answer the question. Naruto watched the battle between Haku and himself and Sasuke, trying to see what Zetsu wanted him to. It was surreal, he supposed, to watch an outsider's point of view of a fight that would have taken his life if it weren't for the interference of said outsider. As he watched Haku's senbon pierce his body, Naruto could imagine that he was once again a human pincushion. The memory was hard to forget. That was all irrelevant though. Zetsu was clearly trying to prove a point about something, and only by observing the fight from a non-combatant's perspective could he figure out what that was. Pushing aside any residual feelings about the fight, the blonde tried to focus on whatever it was his tutor was trying to show him. The fight was remarkably one-sided, he thought, observing glimpses of him, and Sasuke dodging around through the slit Zetsu had watched from. It was obvious that he needed more speed, more situational awareness. Increased weapons proficiency wouldn't do much, as he was already batting away as many of Haku's senbon as he could, though it would help his chosen profession. Taijutsu wouldn't do much against an opponent who could literally vanish inside unbreakable mirror-like constructs. Ninjutsu could be useful, though as the projection restarted and Sasuke tried to melt the ice with a fire release, great fireball technique, to no effect. he realized that perhaps that wasn't what he was supposed to be looking for either. Blue eyes narrowed as the images of himself and Sasuke positioned themselves back to back. Looking for deficiencies in his shinobi skills was rather pointless, since he had no skills going up against Haku. In addition, Zetsu was the type of shinobi who didn't focus on the traditional ninja arts, such as ninjutsu, taijutsu, and genjutsu. The plant man was sneaky and underhanded, relying on his surroundings to meld into and creating duplicates to transform into others, as he had done with Naruto to alleviate Konoha's suspicions regarding the blonde's whereabouts. Zetsu's machinations were subtle, and as such, whatever error he wanted Naruto to find was most likely some small detail that was abstract in nature. Naruto could see a vine creeping its way over to the dome of ice mirrors, as the images of him and Sasuke continued to deflect Senbon. Thousands of needles formed from moisture in the air, and Sasuke kicked him away, and then dove to the side as they converged on the boy's previous location. His eyes went wide with understanding as Sasuke fell forward, two Senbon through his neck. The answer was so obvious he was amazed he hadn't predicted its outcome from the get-go. Zetsu was nothing if not predictable when it came to his favorite slogan. Sasuke and I work together. Oh, he got that much sooner than you expected. Yes, it seems I underestimated his abilities. The blonde ignored the slight at his intelligence. If he wanted to get proper training from Zetsu, he was better off letting the former Kusanine say whatever he wanted. Okay, I get that this is more of your usual stuff, but it's not like we had much of a choice. We needed to work together in order to cover the others back so we wouldn't die. Those are merely excuses. If you were truly devoted to relying on your own abilities, you wouldn't have needed to work with your teammate to survive. Naruto ran his fingers through his hair in frustration. If someone would teach me something, maybe I wouldn't have to work with other people. He closed his eyes and sighed before reopening them and fixing Zetsu with a calm stare. I get what you've been teaching me all this time. But even if I rely on only myself, sometimes I'll be forced to work with other people, unless you teach me enough so I don't have to. His face settled into a determined expression. Assassins work by themselves most of the time, so, will you help me? Zetsu was silent for a long time. Naruto watched the white side's yellow eye trace over his form, settling on the hightiate tied around his neck instead of his forehead. For a moment, the blonde wondered if black Zetsu saw out of his own unnatural eye or if he shared with white Zetsu, as the scrutiny seemed more characteristic of the man's darker side. Finally, black Zetsu stated, "You have made a sound argument. And your chosen profession is apt," white Zetsu added. "You have passed our test, and so we will impart upon you the knowledge you seek." Naruto brightened at that announcement. Really? He hadn't thought convincing Zetsu would be nearly that easy, even accepting that his assumption about the plant man meaning to train him all along was accurate. Would we lie to you, Naruto-kun? Naruto decided that that was a trick question and wisely chose not to answer it. So, what are we starting with? Black Zetsu's yellow eye adopted a luminescent glow once again. This time, the projection that appeared depicted a large, beady-eyed male wearing simple clothes of neutral colors. Instead of being from afar, the perspective was focused directly on the man, and Naruto concluded that Zetsu's viewpoint was as a combatant instead of an observer. "What's this?" he asked, curious. "Watch," chorused Zetsu's two halves. Naruto did as he was told, watching the memory with a careful eye. The other man was talking with a cocky smirk decorating his features, but as the projection lacked sound, the blonde had no way of knowing what he was saying. He finished speaking and then, in a move that surprised Naruto, melded into the dirt. "Hey, that's your..." "Quiet." The Jinchuriki fell silent, observing as a wave of dirt rose up and tried to engulf Zetsu. In an instant, all was black, and Naruto surmised that his tutor had gone underground. In another moment, Naruto was greeted with the sight of light once more. The other man rose out of the dirt, his body appearing to be composed entirely of the same material. He said something and started to sink into the ground, but roots rose up and bound his form. Or tried to, anyway. The man's dirt form broke apart and reassembled outside of the root's grasp. At that point, the projection fizzled out. Naruto turned to his tutor. I thought you said only you could do the. He held out one hand palm down and slowly dropped the other one behind it to mime disappearing into a surface, whistling lowly as he did so. It's called the Kajiro, Naruto-kun, White Zetsu offered after an amused titter, and we are the only ones who can use it. Naruto pointed at the space Zetsu had just been projecting in. So what was that? You tell us. The blonde huffed and crossed his arms before realizing Zetsu was probably trying to, once again, prove a point. Play it again, he requested. Without a word, the projection fizzled back into existence, and Naruto watched it play out with a more careful eye. The entire memory replayed 3 times before Naruto told Zetsu he could stop. How does your Kajiro, the word's unfamiliarity caused him to stumble over it, work? Utilizing chakra, we merge with any nearby flora and travel through it. Nature allows us to conceal our presence and use her bounty for our whims, manipulating all sorts of vegetation and its interconnectedness for ourselves. So, Naruto pondered, his brow scrunching in thought, the difference is that you can use plants to do whatever you want, while he flapped his hand vaguely in the direction the projection had played in, could use chakra to transform his body into whatever he was touching. There was a moment of silence, and then White Zetsu commented, that was impressive, Naruto-kun, though not entirely accurate. The blonde scowled slightly, annoyed that Black Zetsu always had to burst his bubble. What that fool was using was actually 2 jutsu in one. You will focus on learning the first one. It took so long to kill him, White Zetsu whined, and he tasted so icky too. Naruto stared at his tutor blankly, and the ensuing silence made him believe that even Black Zetsu wasn't entirely how to respond to his more immature half. He coughed to break the spell. You were saying something about 2 jutsu, me learning one. Black Zetsu seemed to shake himself from his stupor. Yes. It's known as Shinra Bansho no Jutsu, interjected White Zetsu excitedly. Shut up. Snapped the darker half. White Zetsu's expression crumpled into something resembling an extraordinarily creepy pout, though he remained silent in the wake of Black Zetsu's ire. Its effects somewhat mimic those of the Kajiro, but to a lesser extent. There are several other jutsu that have similar results, though the majority of them require a Doton affinity to use in conjunction with the ground. The Shinra Bansho isn't susceptible to such a restriction. Naruto rubbed his hands together, eager to learn. Awesome. So how does it work? That's for you to find out. But you said you'd train me. We did not say that. Tutor White Zetsu, did you forget our most important lesson? We will impart upon you the knowledge needed to improve yourself, but it's up to you to figure out how to use what we teach. Rely only on yourself, remember? Of course. There was a catch. With Zetsu, there was always a catch. Well, he supposed he couldn't complain too much. The plant man was, after all, teaching him something substantial, and the Shinra Bansho looked like it would be amazingly useful, especially for a ninja planning to specialize in assassination. If you say so, Zetsu, he responded, manipulating chakra for his first attempt at the technique. Why he chose their field to practice in, Naruto couldn't explain. As there was nothing and no one around, it was an optimal location to practice kata and exercises in peace to improve his physical conditioning. The few trees in the area had targets scratched into their trunks and were littered with senbon and kunai. One day, he would get some sort of human dummy to better simulate hitting vital points. The only problem was that, despite the lack of any intrusion by others, the field was still his and Ino's, the place they went to talk about flowers, or teammates, or whatever, and his fellow blonde was completely entitled to show up whenever she wanted. Hey, Naruto. He grimaced slightly before turning around to find the platinum blonde jogging towards him. It had been almost a week since he had failed the first stage of the Chunin exams. He should have known that Ino wouldn't be kept busy for too long. Ino, he returned, keeping his tone neutral. I'll be leaving now. Oh, but I came here to see how you're doing after, failing out of the exam. A surge of anger shot through Naruto at that. He had thought that he didn't care about Ino after the incident in room 301, that he could just write off the friendship that he had spent time forging with her to focus on himself, but apparently it wasn't that easy. "So now you care?" he whispered. Whirling around, he found Ino standing a mere foot away. He glared at her, and she took a step back at the intensity in his blue eyes. "You didn't seem to care enough to say hi to me back before the test started." "Well, I was greeting Sasuke-kun." "I know, I saw. I was there." Somehow, the fact that Naruto wasn't yelling made the conversation much scarier. "You know, I don't get what this obsession with Sasuke is. You, Sakura, what do you even see in him?" "He's cool. And he has such a tragic past." "A tragic past? You mean like growing up without a family, completely alone, skipping meals because you can't pay for them, or because the landlord turns off your gas? Having no friends and doing anything to try to get someone to pay attention to you, that kind of tragic past? And what exactly defines being cool? He doesn't care about other people, he's arrogant, he can't work with others. As someone who has to work with her teammates, I think you would appreciate the value of teamwork." Caught up in his frustrated rant, he missed the hypocrisy of him adopting the mindset of relying only on his own abilities, and thus being similar to Sasuke. "I thought we were friends, Ino, but..." He shook his head. "If you're just gonna forget that I exist because that bastard happens to be around, maybe it's just not worth it." "Naruto, we are friends." Hollow victory, he thought. "And I didn't mean to ignore you. I'm sorry." Naruto waved her words away. "I don't want to hear you apologize. I'll see you around. Maybe." And with that, he vanished into the ground. The Shinra Bansho, he decided, was an awesome technique. It allowed the user to meld seamlessly into any object, organic or inorganic, it made no difference, and just disappear from sight. If Ino's calls from above him were any indication, it also made him incapable of being discovered by sensor-type shinobi, specialist ninja that Zetsu had recently informed him of, capable of detecting others by chakra, although, he supposed, it was also possible Ino just wasn't adept at searching for chakra signatures. Experiments would be required to test the intricacies of the technique, though that would require a second person. Maybe Zetsu would be willing to help? Well, probably not, but it was worth a shot. He waited 5 minutes after he could no longer hear Ino, before slowly releasing his hold on the attack prevention technique and rising out of the ground. It was surprisingly easy to activate the Shinra Bansho, merely requiring an even coating of chakra around whatever was supposed to match the material being melded into. By doing so, the user essentially became a part of the medium. There were other applications to the technique. The projection Naruto had seen implied that he could move through whatever medium he was in, not to mention switch mediums at a whim and resurface from wherever he wanted, but the blonde had yet to get that far. From what Zetsu had told him about sensor-type shinobi, it sounded like there was the potential for him to learn to detect others while remaining hidden from view. That sounded amazingly useful for his future career path. His state of mind thrown off by his confrontation with Ino, the Jinchuriki decided to leave the field and go meet Zetsu. He created a shadow clone to collect the Senbon and kunai littering the area, instructing the doppelganger to drop off the weaponry back at his apartment when he was done, and then headed off in the direction of his tutor. Zetsu greeted him in his normal fashion when he entered the Plantman's stretch of forest. Naruto nodded absently in response before jumping right into what he had accomplished. "So, I figured out how to use Shinra Bansho no Jutsu, but I need some help to test its limits. If you can sense me," he clarified when his only response was white Zetsu blinking blankly at him. "You will need to find someone else to test its limits." Naruto opened his mouth to protest, but Black Zetsu cut across him, stating, "My sensory abilities are much more attuned than the average sensor type. If you are in contact with some type of flora within my vicinity, I will find you, hidden by the Shinra Bansho or not. So, you see, Naruto-kun, it's not a matter of not wanting to, it's just that we are the wrong people to properly test your jutsu against," white Zetsu placated. Then he seemed to brighten considerably. Why don't you ask your blonde friend for help? Yes, run to your little girlfriend for assistance, Black Zetsu sneered. How do you? Naruto began, but then shook his head. Never mind. If Zetsu's sensing capacity really was as impressive as he said, finding out that Naruto spent more time with certain people was probably a trifling thing. Besides, if the former Kusanine had followed him to the land of waves to assure his safety, it wouldn't surprise the blonde too much to discover that his tutor was secretly spying on him within Konoha's walls. I can't. We got into a bit of a fight. Ah, White Zetsu lamented, what happened? Surprised at his tutor's interest, it took the blonde a moment to reply. Oh, I got mad that she ignored me in the Chunin exams. I thought things had changed between us, but I keep getting overlooked for that stupid Sasuke team. It was rather cathartic to be able to insult his dark-haired teammate again. You shouldn't be so quick to break your friendships, Naruto-kun, White Zetsu advised him. Friends are a rare commodity, especially in the world of shinobi. Naruto stared at his tutor for almost a minute, completely dumbfounded. Sometimes, it took a bit of time to work through what Zetsu told him, but nothing even compared to the contradiction the plant man had just started with this statement. What? He managed at last. That's just, what? He repeated. You're telling me I should have friends? His voice sounded a bit more high-pitched to his ears than he was used to, and he was forced to acknowledge the fact that he sounded to be on the verge of hysteria. Speaking with his tutor, especially when Zetsu began to talk in circles and contradictions, seemed to invoke a feeling similar to what Naruto imagined his brain exploding might be like. Well, if you can manage it, why not? The former Kusanine queried innocently. But. The blonde spluttered, resisting the urge to tear his hair out in frustration. What about all that rely only on yourself stuff you always talk about? That remains true. So long as you do not put your faith in the people you deem your friends to protect you when the time comes, what harm is there in having them? They could prove beneficial, such as your need for someone to practice with. Just remember the other lessons you've learned. Friends are convenient tools, easily pliable to your desires. Head spinning with the new paradox Zetsu had just introduced, Naruto tried to organize his thoughts. So, if he was hearing his tutor correctly, it was okay to have friends, but he should be careful when hanging out with them. Relying on them to come through for him was foolish, as putting his faith in Ino to treasure their friendship above her crush for Sasuke had proven to be, but he couldn't get very far in his ninja career, currently, anyway, without having someone to test his skills against. The blonde would just have to continue to make sure not to fall into the trap of the will of fire. Making friends was one thing, but sacrificing his life for them, or strangers, was still out of the question. He would muster forward with this new revelation, but Zetsu's most often quoted line would remain in the back of his head at all times. Naruto groaned at the conflicting natures of all the advice Zetsu kept imparting upon him. His tutor truly was the definition of a walking contradiction. So, it seemed he would require a partner to test his techniques with, as Zetsu was not an optimal person to work with. He wished he had someone to test his poisons on, just to see their effectiveness, but as they were made from nature, Zetsu would most likely claim immunity to anything he brewed up, and it would be rather hard to just ask people who either weren't his friend or didn't trust him to allow themselves to be poisoned. Thinking about his poisons reminded him of his issue with creating the blinding gas. Hey Zetsu, you know what you told me about the manchineel tree? Well, how do I collect the gas after burning the bark? The same way you do everything else, with chakra. Oh. That seemed surprisingly obvious, now that he thought about it. Chakra was practically a requirement for almost everything associated with the ninja world. Granted, he wasn't exactly sure how to use chakra to collect the gas, but at least he had something to work with now. He wouldn't get anything more from Zetsu. The plant man would have told him outright if he wanted the blonde to know the exact answer. He sighed, a long, exhausted sound. It looked like more experimentation was in order. When Naruto returned to his apartment at the end of the day, there was a small purple vase filled with flowers placed just outside his door. He picked it up and brought it into his apartment, setting it carefully upon his countertop. There were only 2 different kinds of plants in the vase. One was comprised of several small flowers with white petals and purple stamens, attached to small twigs broken off of a larger tree, pear blossoms, signifying a lasting friendship. These were surrounded by stalks of ornithogalum, flowers with 6 white petals spread in a roughly star-shaped pattern, which symbolized atonement and reconciliation. Only one person would send him a message written in flowers, and as he stared at the arrangement, he wondered if he was the one in the wrong. Ino had fawned over Sasuke much longer than they had been friends. Maybe some lenience wasn't too uncalled for. He had no previous friendship to serve as a basis for what a proper reaction was to certain scenarios, and Naruto would admit that, despite being encouraged to think through his actions before carrying them out, he was still susceptible to the impulsiveness of his temper. That was problematic, and more than likely to get him in trouble if he didn't learn to become less emotional. Besides, with Zetsu's words still resounding in his head, Naruto was keenly aware that Ino was probably his best bet with respect to a partner willing to test the limits of his techniques, and perhaps poisons. As he was considering what to do, his eyes caught the centerpiece of the floral arrangement. It was an origami flower, folded carefully out of white paper and hidden amongst all the other white of the small bouquet. In the center of the petals was a small note, which he plucked out and opened. "We haven't gotten this far yet," he read, "but an origami flower means I will never take you for granted again. He stared at the note for almost a minute before hanging his head in resignation. Damn. Naruto left his apartment early the next morning with the intention of speaking to Ino before he had to meet up with Team 7 for the first time since failing the exams. It was one thing to realize he had overreacted and was likely in the wrong, it was quite another to actually admit it and make amends. He sighed to himself as he made his way to their field. If Ino had sent him the flowers with the hope that he would forgive her, she was most likely waiting for him in their usual hangout as opposed to Team 10's training grounds or the flower shop. Whatever she thought might happen, she would most likely want to do it in the privacy of their field rather than in a place full of witnesses. The blonde was proven correct when he arrived at his destination to find Ino already there, performing katas and completely oblivious to his presence. He decided to stay silent and watch her until she noticed him, curious to see her practice on her own. Almost every time he'd been privy to her training, it had been Asuma advising her, Shikamaru, and Choji how to better improve their renowned attack formation. Ino's taijutsu style seemed to be a combination of graceful flips and kicks that made it seem like she was gliding over the ground. It utilized her feet to a greater extent than her hands, forcing her to extend her legs in complicated gymnastics Naruto knew he had absolutely no hope of replicating. Then again, as much fun as physically beating someone down sounded, taijutsu wasn't something he particularly excelled at, or even planned on excelling at, and so the fact that Ino seemed to be practicing a style of fighting that he could never pull off wasn't overly surprising. The academy taught a basic form to its students, but given how Konoha's clan specialized in different areas, it was probably expected that they would have their own taijutsu styles to complement their other abilities. Apparently, the Yamanaka clan, or Ino, anyway, was very flexible. Ino stopped abruptly and fell into what Naruto presumed to be an accidental split when her next movement put him in her eyesight. He didn't make a move, instead choosing to wait and see what his fellow blonde would do now that she knew she had an audience. They stared at each other for a long moment before Ino got to her feet and walked over to him. "I'm surprised to see you," she commented, keeping a neutral distance away. "I got your message," he said, referring to the arrangement she'd left him. Then, unsure how to continue, he asked, "What were you practicing?" A frown briefly crossed Ino's features and then disappeared. "It's called Musobato Ryu. I'm not very good at it yet." "Really? You looked pretty." He struggled to come up with the right word, finally settling on fluid. Ino didn't reply to that, and so the two blondes stared at each other in silence until Naruto took a deep breath and said, "I shouldn't have gotten so mad at you yesterday. I've never had friends before you, Shikamaru and Choji, so I'm not good at sharing, I guess." An exhale escaped his lips, creating a sound similar to a horse nickering. I might have overreacted. I kinda have a history of doing that, now that I think about it, especially when it comes to Sasuke. So, I guess what I'm saying is, if you're willing to forget about it, then I am too. Ino remained motionless for so long, Naruto thought he might have blown his chance at reconciling with her. It was strange to acknowledge that yesterday he had been mad enough to break off their friendship, and now here he was, asking her for it back. He had put so much effort into their bond that breaking it over something so trivial seemed stupid. And if what Zetsu said was correct, he needed at least one friend to be able to determine the limits of his abilities. Building the trust required to ask someone to become his guinea pig for poisons would take a long time with someone he wasn't already acquainted with. Repeating that to himself allowed the blonde to convince himself that his apparent fickleness had a reason behind it. Okay, Ino allowed at last, I guess I can do that. Naruto resisted the urge to sigh at her tone. Ino made it sound like she was doing him a favor by accepting his terms when she was the one who had tried apologizing to him the previous day. And he certainly wasn't going to apologize, seeing as how he hadn't technically done anything wrong. But, for what it's worth, Ino continued, voice soft, I am sorry. When I see Sasuke, she corrected, and Naruto found himself appreciative of her effort to not flaunt her affections for the dark-haired boy in front of him. I just sort of forget about everything else. I didn't mean to ignore you. Do you remember what you were like around Billboard Brow in the academy? Naruto nodded, trying to suppress a grimace at the memory. In hindsight, it was a little sickening how reliant upon Sakura's attention he had been before meeting Zetsu. Maybe you should focus on someone who'll actually pay attention to you? He suggested. We'll see, she replied in a tone that indicated she was unlikely to do any such thing. Did you like the flowers? She asked, changing the subject. Huh. Oh yeah? I didn't know you folded origami. I normally don't, was the response as Ino began to stretch, but I felt really bad, and I thought that might be the best way to show that I cared about our friendship. It took a while to get the flower just right. Ignoring the feeling he suspected was guilt tugging at his conscience, the Jinchuriki once again started to watch Ino go through several movements from Muzo Batoryu. When are you gonna meet up with your team? Oh, that's right, I didn't get to tell you. The platinum blonde kicked out with one leg, twirled and lashed out with the other, and then twisted and kicked once more with the first one, but the movement was awkward, and Ino's low curse told him she wasn't pleased with the combo. Instead of continuing, she sat down and gestured for him to do the same. We made it to the final round of the Chunin exams. She declared just as he was taking a seat. Wow, really? She nodded emphatically before going on to explain the secret of the written phase, and then the rules for the second part. Naruto listened with rapt attention to her description of the Forest of Death, mildly disappointed that he had caused Team 7 to fail before reaching the 44th training ground. From the Yamanaka's description, the entire second stage was a survival exercise in the middle of the forest, which, given his new understanding of the many different kinds of plants, sounded like the perfect place for him to excel in. Her retelling of how Team 10 had stolen the other scroll they needed from a team from the hidden waterfall was rather mundane, but given that they had enacted Shikamaru's plan, Naruto wasn't overly surprised. Executing a strategy that had maximum reward with minimal effort sounded exactly like something the Nara would come up with. By the time she reached the point where the Hokage had confronted the teams who had passed the second stage of the Chunin exams, Ino was completely enthralled with her own story. Then, Hokage-sama stated that the teams would be dissolved for the last stage of the exams, which would be a one-on-one style tournament held in 1 month's time. Since we didn't need to train together, Asuma-sensei thought it would be better if we practiced on our own or with our families to better prepare for the final round. She deflated suddenly, all of her enthusiasm vanishing like smoke in the wind. Since my family's jutsu requires the target to stand still, and Shikamaru won't be there to hold them in his cage main, I'm working on my other skills, but it's not going so well. You've still got a month before the third round begins, Naruto pointed out. You'll probably figure out something by then. Ino seemed to recover some of her normal vigor at the reassurance. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, would you be willing to train with me? Well, that was convenient. Once again, Ino had led the conversation directly into what he wanted to talk about. He had almost forgotten how easy it was to talk to his fellow blonde. Sometimes it almost seemed like she could tell what was on his mind. Well, I guess, if you really want me to. Yeah, it'll be good practice to fight against someone I'm not used to, she smirked. You'll be my personal punching bag. We'll see. Who are you gonna be fighting, anyway? Some girl from Odo. Naruto nodded absently. Ino had told him that only 4 teams had made it past the Forest of Death, Team 10, Rock Lee's team, and 1 team each from Suna and Odo. From the sound of it, his fellow blonde had gotten extremely lucky with her opponent, though given Ino's temperament, it was probably a better idea to not tell her that. Well, just let me know when you want to train, he told her. I've gotta go meet up with my team. He didn't even try to hide the skull that crossed his features. Later. Come by the flower shop when you're done. Ino shouted as he departed. Greetings, Naruto-kun. Ga. The blonde jerked in surprise, the kunai in his hand slicing a thin trail across his left arm. His long-sleeved shirt had been discarded long ago, lying by the trunk of a nearby tree. He whirled around to find Zetsu watching him, the white sides yellow. I focused on the cut. I'm sorry, Naruto-kun. White Zetsu bemoaned at the same time, his darker half stated, clumsy fool. Naruto ignored both of them, grabbing one of the scrolls from his holders, unrolling it on the ground, and applying chakra to its surface. In a puff of smoke, a small jar and a spool of bandages appeared, and the blonde uncorked the jar and dipped a finger in, spreading its contents over his cut. He hadn't yet been able to test the efficacy of this ointment yet, but what better time was there than the present? It was rather lucky that he was practicing with non-poisoned weapons, as he had no antidote to any of his poisons. Maybe I should get on that, he realized. It wasn't like he didn't have the time. His meetings with Team 7 had been cancelled by Kakashi until the Chunin exams concluded, which Naruto was perfectly fine with. The less he saw of Sakura and Sasuke, the better. His teacher's decision left him plenty of free time to spend as he wished, and research into antidotes for his poisons, which he would need if he planned on asking Ino to be his guinea pig, seemed like a good way to fill the void. Wrapping the bandages around his arm, he ignored Black Zetsu's insult and said, Sakai, I'm fine. But what are you doing here? Aren't you happy to see us? White Zetsu asked, sounding hurt. Naruto chose not to respond, instead focusing on his own task as he waited for Black Zetsu to take over the conversation. It wasn't yet midnight, but the blonde knew that the plant man's dark counterpart wouldn't put up with his childish side's immaturity for long. He was proven right when Black Zetsu said, he is uninterested in your babble. We are here on business, he continued, directing the latter comment at Naruto. Business? Couldn't this wait until our lesson tomorrow? Being ambushed in the middle of his late-night training by his dual-tone tutor was unusual, and probably a bad omen. No, replied both sides. Tell us, Naruto-kun, what would you do if it was discovered that Konoha was to be attacked? That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfiction. Looking forward to having you on board again.